We live in the most technologically advanced period in human history. Artificial intelligence can generate language, compose music, simulate worlds. Medical science extends lifespan. Global logistics feed billions. Satellites circle the Earth like silent guardians. And yet, missiles still fly. Cities still burn. Children still run from bombs. How is this possible? How can a species intelligent enough to split the atom and map the human genome remain unable to stop killing itself? Perhaps the problem is not technological. Perhaps it is psychological. Perhaps it is spiritual. According to the Surangama Sutra, one of the most profound texts in Mahayana Buddhism, the root of suffering is not outside us. It is not political systems, not resources, not geography. It is delusion. More specifically, ignorance of our true nature and attachment to a false self. Haven't you seen what's happening right now on our beautiful planet? War, poverty, children running in terror, crying beneath falling bombs. Parents losing their children, families torn apart. When I witness this, I cannot help but feel a deep ache in my heart. I have studied the path and practiced meditation for many years, and because of that, I cannot turn away from this suffering. It is simply too real, too painful. At the same time, I am fully aware that as one small individual, I cannot single-handedly change the world. I know that clearly. And yet, no matter how small my role may be, I still long for a world at peace. A world where human beings live with love and genuine happiness. Today, I'm setting aside the ancient scriptures I usually draw from. I won't be quoting the scriptures in full. Instead, I want to apply Buddhist teachings to real life. I'll draw from the essential insights within those priceless teachings to examine a radical idea. War does not begin on battlefields. War begins in the mind. And unless we understand that mind, no amount of progress will save us. In this video, I will also draw on the work of the renowned psychologist Sigmund Freud, particularly his reflections on the progress of civilization and its relationship to war. Look around the world today. Armed conflicts continue across multiple regions. Nations fortify borders. Military budgets increase year after year. Propaganda circulates faster than truth. Advanced drones can strike targets from thousands of miles away. Cyber warfare can cripple infrastructure without firing a bullet. AI can assist in surveillance, targeting, and predictive conflict modeling. The tools evolve. The pattern remains the same. Each side believes it is justified. Each side believes it is defending something sacred. Each side believes the other is the aggressor. From the outside, it appears geopolitical. From the inside, it is psychological. And this is where the Surangama Sutra becomes deeply relevant. Because long before modern nation-states existed, the Buddha diagnosed the same disease: the illusion of a separate self. In the Surangama Sutra, the Buddha repeatedly explains that beings fall into suffering because they mistake illusion for reality. He describes how consciousness becomes entangled in its own projections. The mind grasps at appearances and constructs a false identity. This is avidya, ignorance. Not ignorance as lack of information, but ignorance as misperception of reality. The Surangama Sutra states that all confusion arises because we lose sight of the true mind and chase after shadows. What does that mean? It means we identify with the body, thoughts, emotions, social roles, national identity, religious affiliation. We say, This is me. This is my country. And then we defend it. War begins the moment identity hardens. When the ego feels threatened, fear arises. From fear comes aggression. From aggression, violence. At the individual level, this is conflict. At the collective level, it becomes war. But what exactly is this ego we are speaking about? Is it truly solid? Or is it something constructed, fragile, defensive, and deeply conditioned? To explore this more clearly, we now turn to a psychological lens, the work of Sigmund Freud. The self we defend so fiercely turns out, upon careful examination, to be far less solid than we assume. What we call I appears stable only because memory stitches together fragments of experience into a narrative continuity. But beneath that narrative lies something far more fluid and unstable. The self is not a monolithic entity. It is an ongoing process, a dynamic configuration composed of sensations, memories, habits, conditioned reactions. And yet, despite its fluidity, we cling to it as though it were permanent, indivisible, sacred. This paradox, impermanence mistaken for permanence, lies at the core of both Buddhist psychology and Freudian psychoanalysis. To understand why the ego becomes defensive and ultimately violent, we must first understand how it is constructed. In The Ego and the Id, Freud proposed that the psyche is structured in three interacting systems. The id, the reservoir of instinctual drives; the ego, the mediator between instinct, reality, and morality; the superego, the internalized voice of authority and social norms. The ego, in Freud's account, is not the master of the psyche. It is a negotiator, a fragile mediator, a surface formation that develops gradually as the infant begins to differentiate between inner impulses and external reality. This is crucial. The ego is not born fully formed. It emerges through tension. The infant initially experiences no clear boundary between self and world. Hunger, discomfort, and gratification are immediate and total. Over time, through frustration and delay, the child learns that reality does not obey instinct. The ego forms as a survival mechanism, a regulator. It says, "You cannot have everything immediately. You must adapt. You must manage impulses." In this sense, the ego is necessary. Without it, there would be chaos. But Freud also warned that the ego is precarious. He famously wrote, "The ego is not master in its own house." This single sentence reveals the instability of the self we defend so fiercely. Freud later argued that civilization itself requires the repression of instinct. In Civilization and Its Discontents, he explained that social order demands the redirection of aggressive and sexual drives. Aggression, in particular, cannot simply disappear. It must be repressed, sublimated, redirected. When aggression is turned inward, it strengthens the superego, producing guilt and self-criticism. When turned outward, it produces hostility. The ego stands between these forces like a diplomat negotiating with volatile powers. But here is the problem. Because the ego's job is to maintain coherence and survival, it becomes defensive. Freud described multiple defense mechanisms: projection, rationalization, denial, displacement, reaction formation. These mechanisms protect the ego from anxiety, and anxiety arises whenever the ego feels threatened. Threatened by what? loss of status, loss of control, humiliation, exposure, mortality. Ideological contradiction. When the ego senses instability in its narrative, fear arises, and fear, when linked to aggression, becomes dangerous. The ego feels solid because it is repetitive. Memories reinforce identity. Habits reinforce personality. Conditioned reactions reinforce predictability. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, identity is not essence. It is organization. Freud understood that much of what we call self is unconscious. Desires we deny, fears we repress, traumas we bury. The ego does not control these contents, it manages their appearance. This is why the ego must defend itself. If unconscious material threatens to surface, anxiety spikes. The ego mobilizes defenses. Reality becomes distorted to preserve self-image. Now expand this dynamic beyond the individual. Group psychology and the analysis of the ego. In Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Freud explored how individuals behave in collectives. He argued that when people enter a group, their individual superego weakens, and identification with a leader or ideology strengthens. In a group, the ego merges with a shared ideal. Critical thinking diminishes. Emotional contagion increases. The group provides psychological reinforcement. It stabilizes identity through belonging. But it also amplifies aggression. Freud observed that groups are capable of cruelty far exceeding that of individuals acting alone. Why? Because identification replaces introspection. The individual no longer asks, "Is this right?" Instead, the group narrative answers for them. When the collective ego feels threatened, fear multiplies. And when fear multiplies, aggression scales. Freud's later work introduced the concept of the death drive, thanatos. This controversial hypothesis suggested that alongside the instinct for life, eros, there exists an instinct toward destruction. Civilization restrains this drive, but never eliminates it. Freud wrote that humans harbor a deep reservoir of aggression. It can be softened, redirected, ritualized, but not eradicated. When social cohesion weakens, aggression seeks an outlet. War becomes one such outlet. Here, the mechanism is tragically simple. 1. The ego identifies with a nation or ideology. 2. That identity feels threatened. 3. Anxiety rises. 4. Aggression is mobilized. 5. Violence is justified as defense. The ego rarely perceives itself as aggressor. It frames violence as protection. One of Freud's most significant contributions was his analysis of projection. Projection occurs when unacceptable impulses are attributed to others. Instead of recognizing aggression within, we see it outside. He is dangerous. They are evil. We must defend ourselves. The external enemy becomes the container for internal conflict. This mechanism is not limited to individuals. It becomes geopolitical. Nations project fears onto rival states. Ideologies project corruption onto opponents. The ego remains intact because the threat is always out there. But the violence that follows is very real. When the ego feels threatened, fear arises. Freud understood anxiety as a signal, a warning that something destabilizing is approaching. The ego can respond in two ways: reflection Defense. Reflection requires strength and insight. Defense requires speed and reaction. Collective systems often default to defense. Fear activates primitive circuitry. Aggression mobilizes quickly. Violence appears justified. At the individual level, this manifests as arguments, hostility, personal conflict. At the collective level, it becomes mobilization, militarization, war. The same psychological structure scales upward. Freud was pessimistic about the future of civilization, not because he underestimated intelligence, but because he understood instinct. He believed that no degree of technological advancement could eliminate aggression embedded in the human psyche. If anything, technological progress increases the efficiency of aggression. The ego, armed with more power, becomes more dangerous. Without insight into its own mechanisms, the ego uses intelligence as a tool of domination. And this is where Freud's analysis converges with Buddhist thought. Both traditions recognize the self we defend is unstable. Our aggression is reactive. Our perception is distorted by attachment. When we mistake this constructed ego for something absolute, we justify extreme measures to protect it. The tragedy lies in this. The ego defends something that is not fixed. It fights to preserve a narrative. It wages war to maintain an identity. It sacrifices lives for a story. And yet the story is composed of memories, habits, and conditioned reactions, all subject to change. Freud revealed the fragility of the ego. Buddhism reveals its emptiness. When fear grips this fragile construct, aggression follows. When aggression scales collectively, violence emerges. When violence organizes politically, war erupts. The battlefield is the final expression of an inner structure that has never been fully understood. If we want to understand war, we must understand the ego. If we want to transcend war, we must see through the illusion we are defending. Because the self we protect so desperately may be nothing more than a temporary arrangement of experience, mistaken for something eternal. What Freud described psychologically, the Surangama Sutra described spiritually centuries earlier. Both traditions point to the same mechanism. When a constructed identity hardens, suffering multiplies. And when that identity is shared by millions, delusion becomes collective. The ego does not only operate individually, it scales. When millions of individuals identify with my country, my people, my ideology, a collective ego forms. This collective ego feels insulted, humiliated, endangered. The sutra warns about this mechanism when it describes how beings become trapped in karmic cycles through shared delusion. Collective karma is not mystical punishment. It is synchronized ignorance. When enough people believe the same illusion, it gains momentum, and momentum becomes history. The sutra describes how the deluded mind externalizes its own confusion. Instead of recognizing inner greed, anger, and fear, we project them outward. We create enemies. Evil is no longer something we examine within ourselves. It is relocated, projected outward. This move is subtle, almost automatic. Psychologically, it soothes us. If the darkness is out there, then we remain innocent. But spiritually, the cost is immense. We don't have compassion for others, because we have created vast divisions between you and me, between what is yours and what is mine, between your country and my country. We become deluded by these distinctions, mistaking them for something real, something obvious. And one day, the distance grows so wide that understanding can no longer cross it. compassion cannot survive it. To the point, violence no longer feels like cruelty. It feels like righteousness. War, then, is no longer a tragedy. It becomes a duty. Technological advancement enhances capacity. It does not transform consciousness. The sutra emphasizes that the root problem is not material poverty. It is attachment. A society can be wealthy and still be consumed by rivalry. It can be educated and still be blinded by pride. The ego evolves. It becomes more sophisticated. It learns to speak the language of morality. It justifies itself in the name of justice, security, even peace. But underneath, the mechanism remains unchanged. I must protect what I believe I am. And that belief is mistaken. If war originates in delusion, then peace requires awakening. The Surangama Sutra does not merely diagnose, it prescribes. The sutra guides practitioners to examine perception itself. Who is aware? Where does awareness reside? Does it have boundaries? When deeply investigated, awareness cannot be confined to a fixed self. There is seeing, but no seer. There is hearing, but no hearer. This insight weakens the rigidity of identity, and when identity softens, defensiveness softens. The illusion of separateness dissolves when interdependence is seen clearly. No nation exists independently. Economies intertwine. Cultures influence each other. Even the air we breathe circulates globally. If we truly perceived interbeing, not intellectually, but viscerally, harming another would feel like harming ourselves. The sutra's teaching points to a fundamental unity beneath surface diversity. War depends on fragmentation. Wisdom reveals continuity. Compassion is not sentimental weakness. It is the natural response when the illusion of separateness dissolves. When you no longer perceive the other as fundamentally other, violence loses its psychological fuel. Compassion interrupts the ego's narrative. It says, "This being too seeks happiness. This being too fears suffering." That recognition destabilizes hatred. Individual awakening matters, but collective transformation requires education that includes emotional intelligence, leadership grounded in humility, media that reduces polarization, spiritual literacy alongside scientific literacy. The sutra emphasizes moral discipline, concentration, and wisdom as a triad. These are not relics of ancient monastic life. They are blueprints for civilizational survival. Ending war is not naive. What is naive is believing that external treaties alone can eliminate internal delusion. Diplomacy is necessary. Policy reform is necessary. Economic cooperation is necessary. But without inner work, cycles repeat. We must challenge the mythology of the separate self. We must question the narratives that divide humanity into absolute camps. We must cultivate leaders who understand their own minds before wielding power over millions. And we must take responsibility personally. Ask, where do I cling? Where do I react from fear? Because the battlefield exists within each of us. When anger is understood rather than obeyed, war weakens. When pride dissolves into humility, hostility fades. When identity loosens, space for dialogue appears. Peace is not passive. It requires courage. The courage to dismantle illusion. The world has never been more advanced. And yet, without wisdom, advancement amplifies destruction. The Surangama Sutra teaches that suffering begins when we forget our true nature and grasp at illusion. War is collective forgetting. Peace is collective remembering. Remembering that beneath language, borders, and ideology, consciousness is shared. Remembering that the enemy is a mirror. Remembering that what we defend so fiercely may not be real. If humanity is to survive its own intelligence, it must outgrow its ego. Technology can extend our reach. Only wisdom can restrain our aggression. The question is not whether we are capable of peace. The question is whether we are willing to see through the illusion that makes war seem necessary. And that journey begins, not in parliaments, not in military bases, but in the silent inquiry into who we truly are.